Here, read this.
Woof.
Hello everybody, Ash here from the Here Read This podcast. Now, a couple of days ago, I uploaded an episode all about The Black Arrow by Robert Louis Stevenson. So today I thought I'd make just a quick introductory video as a sort of trailer for the podcast, but also to encourage you to read the book. So the first reason I chose it was that it overlaps rather nicely with some of the other material I've been covering on Here Read This, namely Shakespeare's history plays, and in particular his Henry VI plays. These are the plays set during the Wars of the Roses. We hear sort of fleeting references to the characters we're familiar with from Shakespeare's plays. King Henry is referred to early on as just coming out of his madness. There are references to Queen Margaret, the Earl of Warwick, the Kingmaker, and there is a memorable appearance towards the end of the novel by the Duke of Gloucester, the future Richard III. We'll come to him in a little bit. First off, I want to give you more of a taste of the novel. So it was originally serialised in Young Folks magazine. It came out over 17 weekly instalments, and these two chapter segments of the novel tend to end on a cliffhanger because Stevenson was trying to keep his audience hooked week in and week out. He'd already serialised Treasure Island, which actually had not been a blinding success in serial form. So in a way, The Black Arrow is his attempt to write something a bit more commercial. Now, one of the things I think is interesting about The Black Arrow is that it shows you the Wars of the Roses from the perspective of normal people in England. I think I quoted the historian Peter Saccio in my Henry VI episodes, who stressed that the Wars of the Roses was this dynastic clash. It was a fight amongst the nobility, an internecine quarrel about who was the true heir to Edward III, who was the sort of forefather of both of the warring houses of York and Lancaster. And as Saccio pointed out, during this quarrel between the nobility, the peasants tended to till their fields and the merchants plied their trade. It wasn't anything like a civil war on the scale of the 100 Years' War in France or as all-encompassing and all-involving as a world war. The Tudors and Shakespeare built it up as this fight that sucked the entire country into it, but that's rather actually misleading. And although Dick, our main character, is sucked into famous battles, he only has a sort of vague connection to the grander events. He begins as a sort of default Lancastrian on the side of the king, and then later swaps sides, but not for any sort of political reasons, but for personal motives. He discovers that his father had been murdered by his guardian, and decides to join a bunch of rebels, the Black Arrow Fellowship. I think I said in my podcast that Sir Daniel, that's Dick's guardian, was a Lancastrian, which is only partially true. He actually swaps sides as well. He is a sort of magnate. Is he a member of the squirearchy? I've always wanted to use the word squirearchy, but he's a sort of a magnate who swaps sides depending on which way the wind's blowing. So despite the fact that everyone is caught up in the conflict in the Wars of the Roses, you do get a sense of this sort of arbitrary connection to the nobility and their quarrel. And the book's a real kind of romp. If you have fond memories of reading Treasure Island and you've never read The Black Arrow, I strongly recommend it. It's pacey, it's quite daft in places, there are some good throwaway lines. It's a nice meld of history and then sort of Shakespeare history. A lot of the sort of famous events are either reimagined or just referred to in passing, probably because Stevenson was writing at speed. He knocked this out in a couple of months. He was actually recuperating in France from a bout of illness. And the Shakespeare connections go deeper, I think, than just the sharing the same historical material as the Henry VI plays. There is actually kind of a spirit of Shakespearean comedy. There's even there's a cross-dressing theme with lovers in the woods. And the sort of farcical knockabout kind of pace of a lot of it is quite early Shakespeare, I would say. I should probably warn you that Stevenson took a low view of the book at times, dismissing it as tushery, which was his word for this sort of historical adventure story he just knocked out. But he expressed sort of conflicting sentiments about it as well. And he did agree to have it published in novel form, admittedly for quite a nice check. But he was very proud of his portrayal of Richard III, well, the future Richard III, here the Duke of Gloucester. That was another slight historical error. Richard wasn't Duke of Gloucester at this point. He gets referred to as my Lord of Wensleydale at one point, which is quite funny. But yes, his portrayal of Crookback, of Richard Duke of Gloucester, is quite heavily based on Shakespearean portraits and also the sort of history that Shakespeare was reading, this Tudor propaganda image of Richard, the hunchbacked or crook-backed evil villain. However, there is a bit more to Stevenson's Richard than that. He is, he's very brave. I know bravery is sort of morally neutral, I suppose, but in this sort of boy's adventure story, that does put him on a pedestal. Nevertheless, he is clearly malevolent, quite ruthless, and vindictive. There's been some really interesting criticism of this portrayal of Richard, and the suggestion that perhaps it is another of Stevenson's sort of doppelganger. He bears a passing resemblance to Stevenson himself in that he is physically frail. I think he gets described as a sickly boy at one point, which is quite Stevenson-ish, but also to the main character, Dick Shelton, another Richard. Gloucester himself points out the connection between them and makes much of the fact that they are two Richards in this together. Which brings me on to my guest for the podcast. I was joined by Jeremy Hodges, who is a Stevenson expert who has written a magnificent biography of Stevenson, which is actually free to read online. I'll link that below as well. He's written a book on Stevenson's time in Paris, but the book we talked about most was Mrs. Jekyll and Cousin Hyde, which is a study of Stevenson's cousin, Catherine de Mattos. Really, really interesting book presenting an alternative origin story for Jekyll and Hyde. Strongly recommend you give that a read and listen to the podcast and read The Black Arrow. And also thank you to RLS Online at Napier University who brought it to my attention that I'd somehow released my podcast unknowingly on the anniversary of The Black Arrow's first publication in 1883 in Young Folks magazine. I was sort of weirdly chuffed by that, even though I can claim absolutely no credit for it. So there you have it, The Black Arrow, this a fun adventure romp. It's a light read. I think if you are a fan of Treasure Island, you'll really enjoy it. And if you are interested in the history of the Wars of the Roses and reading an alternative take on the material of Shakespeare, I think it'll be right up your street. All of that's linked below. I'm going to do another video on a bizarre adaptation of The Black Arrow that I found on YouTube. But until then, happy reading.